this working group is about enabling interop across canvases. So hopefully you're all here for that reason, and we can all travel on this airplane together. Today will be a little more unstructured maybe than some of the meetings in the future because we didn't know exactly who would be involved from like which projects and what their specific interests are. So this will be a little bit more exploratory discovery style. That being said, Orion and I did spend some time putting together like somewhat of a structure to go through and kind of we have our thinking of what would be kind of next steps for enabling interop. But if other people have thoughts, this is not a like plan set in concrete or anything. Orion, do you have anything to add before I kind of go through the agenda and we just get started?
I think you can go for it.
Cool. Well, first off, massive thanks to Orion for even proposing this on in a tweet, and then I foolishly responded and said I'll help, and so here we are. So thanks for being the initiating energy, Orion. All right, so interop across canvases. As I mentioned, we're all kind of here for that same goal. I wanted to start by sharing my screen real quick and share. Uh, let's see. Yeah, so Open Canvas Working Group, what we're hoping to do is today be a little bit more unstructured. I already mentioned that. In terms of an agenda, I'd like to talk about maybe some near-term goals and then break those goals into projects that we can work on, like small time-bound things that we could go do, maybe over the course of a few days or weeks that would drive towards those goals. And then the last part will actually like talk about next steps, how we could break up and work on things together. But it wouldn't be a conversation about standards without this famous XKCD comic. One thing that we'll need to talk about is, JSON Canvas exists. It is this very Obsidian specific format that that we could build on. And as Orion and I were talking more about this, yes, there's a lot that would need to be done to extend it to support many of the use cases of things like TL Draw and Zwibbler and some of the other folks that I've seen in the room. But we should I think our goal right now is let's see if we can start from the standard, even though the standard is only a few weeks old, and see if we can evolve from there rather than creating a whole new one. And so that kind of leads us to like our first question, which is to fork or not to fork. As Orion and I have been working with the JSON Canvas format and looking at a variety of different canvas types and thinking about their feature set and that kind of thing, we think it makes sense to actually try to stay with JSON Canvas and evolve it from there. We've had a few conversations with Capano from Obsidian, who will be like, I guess, following up asynchronously on this meeting. And there is some interest in seeing JSON Canvas extended. So we'll see like kind of how that works. Because right now it is a sort of an Obsidian shepherded thing. The governance falls under that. Orion, anything to add here? Talking about JSON Canvas fork, not fork. Do you want to talk about your experiences using it for the TL Draw export?
I think I won't for now. I'll keep accumulating my pile of thoughts and then dump all those on your ones.
Cool. That works. I'm going to bring up the chat real quick, make sure that I'm not missing things there. All right. Yes. I see the chat. Nothing there yet. Yeah. So in terms of next steps, like maybe we could go around the room real quick and people could talk about like just mention the name of the project that you're working on. That way we know kind of who's in the room. I see a few people have made have put it in the title of their username or whatever and display name in Zoom. But maybe we could just, I'm just going to start calling people's names. And if you want to unmute and tell us or drop into chat and tell us what project you're working on, just because we sort of have like a roster. Steve, it looks like you're with Zwibbler.
Just real quick before we do that, I think it'd be good if we try and keep these like 15, 30 seconds, super brief, just so that as we have this large number of people, we won't take up too much time.
You would have to have a very long name of a product in order to take more than 15 or 30 seconds to say it.
Well, we'll have a good amount of time to get
Yeah,
to know each other, I'm sure.
exactly. This is just your project. Tell me which project you're working on. Steve Zwibbler, thumbs
That's
up.
right.
Yep. Dragon notebook.io. Thanks for putting that in your Zoom. Max, we've got Graphing Out and CC. Do you want to expand on what CC is real quick? Whatever that acronym stands for?
Yeah, so it's two things. Graphing out is for graphs in out. So it's a graph format converter. It's
Mhm.
open source. And CC is Calpano connected, still in stealth mode. That's a graph visualizer.
Perfect.
Next.
Great. Lou has TL Draw in her Zoom display name. Looks like Christopher has Excalidraw. Great to have both of those in the room. Luke has UIC, which is a university, I believe.
Yeah, right. So I'm an academic. I'm University of Illinois at Chicago. And so we've been working on collaboration software for a long time for science, basically. And it's a series of software called SAGE. And we are at the third iteration, SAGE 3.
Got it. Sage. Okay, cool. And then Alperin, I may be misspelling your name, but mispronouncing.
I'm not
Lurking.
from one of the projects. Yeah, I'm just here to contribute if I can.
Great. Kako, we've got Git perhaps.
Yeah, we're working in an infinite canvas where you can collaborate with others and also with AI. So everyone brings its own AI to the canvas and you can interact with the elements and the AI can also create or modify elements. That's the idea.
Awesome. That's awesome. Moritz, React Flow. I've seen that project. Philip, you're on, I don't see a name there. Do you want to unmute and tell us what you're working on?
Yeah, hi. So I'm just product designer from Berlin, very much into the topic, not working on a specific project, but just very interested.
Cool. Very cool. And then we've got Chris Cadcad, which I think Cadcad might be the project name. Certainly a whole category of products.
Hey, so CAD/CAD stands for Complex Adaptive Dynamical Systems Computer-Aided Design. It's a Python library for doing complex systems engineering, simulation modeling, combining systems dynamic modeling with agent behavior modeling.
That's super cool. That's definitely pushes it and it pushes things in an interesting direction. John Ganarella, I'm trying to remember which project you were from.
Yeah, Christopher Schenk and I are working on basically bidirectional visualization and structural editing of some little languages, specifically in state charts. So a little overlap with David's work there with XState, but also with high graphs.
Yes, that's right. The high graph stuff. I remember, and I was looking at Chris's slides from this weekend where he described high graphs and that kind of stuff. So Chris, I assume you're working with John. Do you have anything to add?
Not at the moment.
Okay, cool. And then Brad mentions in chat that he's an independent file format enjoyer, which is a great title. And yeah, I think Elon from Block Science. So I think that might be a coworker of Orion. Do y'all work together or?
Yep. He's actually right over here.
Oh.
Across the room. Great. Cool. Well, that's a great set of representation from a bunch of different projects. I think the nice thing, Orion and I have kind of done a survey of different projects. We'll have to add a couple of columns based on some of the folks who are here today. But I think the nice thing is I think we're in sort of a sweet spot where JSON Canvas can work for most of these scenarios. Obviously, you guys are smart enough probably to opt in to something that would work for your tool or could be made to work for your tool. I think one of the ways that we've been realizing where JSON Canvas and where we think the format could go would be is there's a type of canvas where the relationship between the objects in the canvas and sort of what they conceptually represent is the most important thing about the canvas, right? And that is true of Obsidian and that kind of stuff. Layout obviously does exist on a 2D canvas. You have to lay things out and you want them to not overlap each other and you'd like them to remain relatively stationary and all that kind of stuff. But there's another type of canvas that's more like working in Figma, which is the thing that you're making in the canvas. That is, you know, whether it's a picture of some, that is the important part. It's not actually about the nodes or the relationships between the nodes or the sort of the information that's encoded in the relationships between all the nodes. It's something else. And I think we're intending to support the former. And I think just about everyone here is working on a project where the former is true. Is sort of, I wish I had made a tree of this. I need to make a graph of, or a diagram of this, but basically it's like, is the most important thing the nodes and edges and relationships, or is the most important thing the visualization? If the most important thing is nodes and edges, then you're probably in the right place. The next thing that we're going to have to figure out is, does your canvas like have an X and Y coordinate, or do you do auto layout? That feels like the next fork down the road. So in many cases, something like GraphViz or Mermaid, or, and I'm maybe some of your projects as well, possibly state chart generators, possibly React Flow. The X and Y position isn't manually specified by the user of the canvas, and so you end up having some sort of auto layout. And the question is, are we going to be able to support both of those in a really elegant way? Because right now, Obsidian is the case where you manually drag things around. The user puts things where they want them, and then you get an XY coordinate. And so that's kind of what but for all of you who've gotten here, does that make sense as sort of a taxonomy? Like, nodes and edges are the most important thing, and then there's a further taxonomy break. I'm going to pause for a second.
I think like the taxonomy does make sense. For the use case of Excalibur, like I think the first one where you mentioned like node and edges, I don't think it's actually like the main use case of Excalibur. I think the main use case is actually like drawing like putting stuff in the canvas, and sometimes you're going to use like edges and arrows, but I don't think this is like the biggest and overwhelming use case. And so if this like the goal of the like spec is on the first one, I don't think like it's going to be like super valuable for Excalibur, but this is what I'm getting from just like hearing your pitch.
Yep, that makes sense. Orion, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think we can probably kind of shift that border out slightly, where I think Figma might be in a gray area there, but I think a better illustration of where that something outside of this would be the tool Everyone Draw, right, which is this big multiplayer canvas, but you're actually basically doing like pixel art, where the outcome is something much closer to something like Photoshop. It's entirely visual, and there isn't any way to even represent relationships between objects in that canvas.
Yeah, if I'm understanding right, I guess one reaction viewpoint that we had is like in some ways the JSON canvas specification was quite minimal, that would allow for like building on top of, but we did also sort of find that there were some things that were actually quite opinionated already, that would make certain things, like, it makes it hard to always be additive, I think. So for example, like the edges having specific information about like their positioning, which is just not how our canvas works at TealDraw, really. So I mean, I don't know what we would do if we were to try to make it work really well with it, what we would do to make it compatible. It would feel slightly strange to, I don't know, maybe ignore some of those or like override them, or, so basically, I think a big question for me is whether to do additive changes or whether to like go back and just sort of review what we've got so far. Because perhaps from what I understand from what you said, like we might be deciding what the first chunk of work is. Yeah, so is that adding on or is that reviewing? And I don't know. Sorry.
So I think a a common piece of input from the tools that I've seen talking about the JSON canvas is like largely in line with that, right? That there are actually already some things that are too that are too specific to Obsidian, and even though it's not the kind of change that is like preferred for a spec, it does seem like most of the good paths forward would actually involve loosening some of some of those constraints, moving them out of required fields and making them optional and so on, which would almost assuredly be a kind of breaking change. But that might be the kind of the only path forward there, if to avoid having a really kind of gnarly additive mess where like the additions end up undoing stuff that you did before.
Yeah, I think, like the spec is great for a certain type of canvas. But now that we're thinking about, and it's also great because it's brought us all together right now, which is pretty incredible. But if we're going to try to make it something that every kind of canvas can get involved in, it feels like a slightly different design problem. So yeah, I completely agree. Completely agree. Oh, I think you're muted, Jeff, if you're talking.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I think that is the big question for like, it's pretty clear that if we, and like Ryan said, from reviewing the use cases of different canvases and talking to folks, it's pretty clear that whatever change that if JSON Canvas is going to make it, it's going to be a breaking change. I don't think we can do like an additive change. And I think the biggest one from my perspective is there's things that we basically need like a properties bag on nodes and on edges that has a couple of properties to it. One, that everything in it is optional. And two, that an implementing canvas that doesn't know what an optional node is, like item in that properties bag is, should not touch or edit it or mess with it. So that basically allows each canvas to treat the properties bag as sort of like an annotation layer on this base node object. And then I think from there, we can kind of start extending the types. If you're not familiar with, if you don't have the like JSON Canvas memorized, I did make this spreadsheet for myself to start thinking about like what support. I started with Canopio for a very specific reason. I don't know if you guys saw that Canopio already integrated or JSON Canvas export and import. That being said, I did try it this morning and it didn't work. So I'm not sure why I wasn't able to debug why. It was visually inspecting the JSON Canvas export, and I couldn't see anything that would cause Obsidian to not render it. But yeah, so another problem is going to be like, how do we sort of do continuous integration testing over these integrations to make sure that they continue working? But anyway, the reason I picked Canopio as well, they've already implemented it, and two, Canopio is very similar to Obsidian. It doesn't support shapes. It only supports text objects, links, groups, interestingly, and edges between like text objects. So very similar to the feature set, maybe the most similar of any of the tools that I've seen. But even then, there's sort of differences there. And so I think the big question is, would the Obsidian, if we could release a version of JSON Canvas like 2.0 that allows us, that's like signals that this is a breaking change, that allows us to move some of these attributes into an optional properties bag. And then we have that sort of guarantee around properties that they won't get clobbered by other tools when they open them up. I think that enables a lot of experimentation, at least, to where you can start seeing whether some of these different tools can communicate with each other. Since Excalidraw and TLDraw are both representatives from both are in the room, those feel like another two canvases that are very similar in terms of their feature set. They have a very different vibe, but it feels like the people that I talk to are kind of, they either use one or the other. And and there's, in fact, on the DXOS team, we actually have TL draw people and we have Excala draw people. We even have like one guy that uses draw.io. But they pick these things because they have a specific feeling to them. But it feels like if we could figure out a format that allows canvases that are at least very near to each other in feature set to interop first, that feels like the easy first step of like, that's like baby steps. And then we can figure out how to map between canvases that have like slightly, more and more differences between them. So I was going to suggest as a first project, basically hacking the JSON canvas specification. Well, is it possible? Here was my question. Would it be possible to use the existing JSON canvas 1.0 to have TLDraw and ExcalaDraw communicate something? Doesn't have to be the rich full feature set of either one of those tools. And then it might be interesting to think about like, okay, well, how would we add one more feature? And then what would that look like to extend JSON Canvas to add that one more feature? And that's kind of where I started with this particular spreadsheet, is I was thinking, okay, what is in JSON Canvas 1.0? And then what would it mean to add one more field or to make one structural change? And we can sort of evolve from there. Anyway, I said a lot of things there. Yeah. Thoughts on, go ahead, Orion. Yeah.
Just one thing kind of on this question of how to take what already exists with JSON Canvas, which I just want to mention, we're definitely not going to figure it out right now. But I think it makes sense that for any kind of open standard, especially around interop, we really need a kind of a process of moving forward with these changes, and importantly, a process that is not like any one of us individually, and also ultimately long term can't really be Obsidian. I like to think that they'll come to agree with that, right? So I just wanted to plant that in this conversation, that that kind of how we longer term govern the evolution of any spec that we have is also, I think, an important part of success here.
Yeah, I think one step I'd like to see is like a low hanging fruit is like, can we exchange sticky notes between all those tools? For instance, like I make sticky note files, I export it, I send it to TLDraw, and it works, and or the opposite. Even if it doesn't render the same way, it's fine. But I think to me that's a minimal. It's a rectangle with a piece of text, a position XYZ, and then TLDraw as arrows and so on. I would ignore them, for instance, and say like that. So very low hanging fruit just to try. And
yeah, that seems, Luke, that seems like a great thing that is in line with kind of what I was thinking of. Like JSON Canvas right now supports text node types. And so if TLDraw and ExcalaDraw and our Sage 3 or whatever are reading these, exchanging information via Canvas, basically text types are the things that they have to exchange, or like that would be one of the simplest things that we could start with, would be these text blocks. And yeah, you could make those you immediately get into the problem of Nopio, for example, doesn't require X and Y, or no, width and height. I mean, this should be optional. Yeah, it doesn't require a width and a height. It just requires an XY position, and then it auto renders the width and height. So yeah, you get into some of those sticky things. I think that's where I think what you're mentioning as a project is, so this is kind of moving from goals to projects. Our goal is to see interop across all these different canvases. The project, what I'm thinking of in terms of how we get there is sort of taking these baby steps for interop between the two. And so now would be the time where people could say, I would be volunteering to take on X project to try something out over the next few weeks, and then kind of let people know how that goes and we learn from it. So does anybody have anything that they've wanted to try and or already trying that would kind of take a step in the direction of interop? using the JSON canvas format to begin with, or using something different.
I mean, I know Orion has already done like a mini experiment, but I don't know if that was actually using JSON canvas or if that was using I don't know, just a hand done thing. So I'm curious to hear about how that went from Orion. In the past, we have done a tiny amount of Excalidraw to TLDraw conversion, partly for just experimenting with, is this a feasible idea? And that obviously didn't involve a standard or anything. That just involved looking at Excalidraw format and allowing people to paste it into TLDraw. I think the motivation for that was to try to, you know, be an example of interop. But I don't know if that still works or not. But yeah, I'm curious from Orion how your interop experiment went.
Yeah, so that was a very brief experiment, mostly just to have a good video for Twitter. That was using basically a subset of the JSON canvas spec. And at least at the time of the video, it was really only one way from TLDraw to Obsidian. So I just set up a small server TLDraw. So you go from the TLDraw page to the server, and then that does some very, very basic translation. Luckily, there is some amount of kind of shared design choices there already. I put together a spreadsheet of a kind of comparison table between tools, and one of the things I was looking at was this one here. So if you look at the stuff around coordinates near the top, basically all of them have made the same choice to follow what the web does, with positive X going to the right, positive Y going down. And so the fact that there were that kind of shared set of choices around coordinates, as well as both using like compatible ID schemes of just basically unique strings, that made it pretty trivial. And looking at the table, it seems like some of those basics are going to be shared between a lot of these tools already.
Related to that, like a project that I'm going to be working on over the next couple of weeks, is we have a tool at DXOS called Composer. Composer has a plugin for TLDraw. And so you can draw TLDraws inside Composer, and we also have local file export. So Composer is a local first Notion / Airtable mashup. Basically, it's like completely extensible. So creating a new plugin, like a TLDraw plugin, is like very simple to do. And so one of the things that we need to do is save those TLDraw files to the file system. We are currently doing that by saving out the JSON snapshot of TLDraw, and we'd love to do that by writing it to a .canvas file. We know that right now that would be super lossy, but we could write both. We could write like the JSON file and the canvas file and just have them sitting right next to each other, and that would allow people who are using Composer with, say, Obsidian, could open that canvas in Obsidian immediately. If Orion or someone, or Lou or someone from TLDraw or someone in the community wanted to add that sort of TLDraw to canvas export, we would be happy to like pick that up and put it in our software today. And then we would get to like actually experiment with that. I'm an Obsidian user as well, so I would find value in that immediately and would be able to kind of make that part of my normal daily work and be able to say, hey, this is continuing to work. Right? I would be the human integration test on that feature.
Yeah, I mean, let me speak to the rest of the team and say that that's something that Jess Martin wants as a human, and I don't know. Yeah, let me speak to the team and I
Lou-
don't know what the outcome of,
Yeah.
of that would be. But you know, like that, it would be great if that existed. I think that's like our view. I think that the hard part might be how much like hacky work is involved. I think with the current JSON canvas spec, like you said, it would be quite lossy. I think from my gut reaction from looking at it is that a lot of the sort of constructs in it, if I was building to target that, I might not use those. I might do it in a slightly different way, like maybe like baking in some data into names and text, and I don't know, some sort of weird weird set. I don't know. I think it would be quite hacky, but could be a worthwhile experiment to kick things off. I'll speak with the team.
One note on these kinds of next steps is that I think it's both a really useful outcome of this first meeting to have some specific things to sink our teeth into. I think it's also maybe worth mentioning longer term timelines, and there's two things I want to mention. One is that it's probably going to be more productive if we don't treat this working group as a kind of as an interest group. I mean, it might be that as well, right? Like we all probably love Canvas stuff and we'll happily talk about it. But having some kind of bounded long-term goal emerge over these next few meetings would be great. Maybe that's 6 months, maybe that's a year, depending on what the concrete goals are that we end up with. There's one more thing I want to mention in there, which is that there is a more aspirational potential outcome specifically for the tools that currently or in the future support multiplayer, especially real-time multiplayer, which is taking the work on the file format and basically extending that to real-time collaboration. I personally would find it incredibly magical if my friends who prefer Excalidraw and use that all the time could interoperate with my TLDraw friends and be able to doodle on each other's stuff from different clients. I think that'd be great, but that doesn't apply to all of these tools here.
Sense. Yeah. Okay. Oh, Lou, I had one more question. If someone from the community wanted to contribute the code that does the TL draw to JSON Canvas export, is that possible based on the way things are currently set up with your project? Like, could someone open a PR and add that functionality?
Yeah, I mean, like, if someone from the community wanted to give it a crack, I think that would be very valuable. And I think the value would be in testing out and finding out where where any limitations are and where there's scope to improve. I don't see it being like I think it would be quite hard, is what I'm saying. But I think it would be very bad. So it may, whether it's
so your reticence isn't like this is not allowed. Your reticence is like, could anyone outside of the team even pull this off?
No, I don't know if anyone inside the team can pull it off. That's why. Like, I don't know if anyone, not because it's like yeah, not because it's canvases are hard, but because the JSON canvas spec is quite young, and so on. That's why. But I think it would be valuable for us for as a learning exercise, if that makes sense at this point. Yeah,
I think that's the main thing I was thinking of is like
yeah,
having a version that works with JSON Canvas 1.0 will be extremely lossy, probably not even that useful. But it would be really interesting to say, well, here's how we mapped between the internal data model in this canvas and the current specification for JSON Canvas. And that's kind of where I was starting with the spreadsheet of like mapping between like actual fields, wanting to get down to the level of nodes in this program have these specific fields. Like, does this concept even exist in this canvas? Can you?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess I'm just trying to manage expectations a little bit with anyone who like wants to go out and spend like, 72 hours straight with no sleep and make this. It would be very valuable, and personally I'd love to see it. And but the value would be in the learning. The value wouldn't be in necessarily, we're gonna all use this all of a sudden. Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, you put that really well as well, I think.
Cool. Similar question for other folks' projects. Just like, does anybody, the two questions really. Would you be interested in, or like having a JSON Canvas 1.0, like existing version of the spec, and or here's how I would modify the spec if I could, like JSON Canvas 2.0 export, and doing that from the tool that you're working on now is like question one. The question two would be, is it possible for someone on from the community that's not you or not on your team to actually do that? Because we can definitely put these, there are other people who are going to be following along with these meetings. And if we can say, here's a way to get involved. We wrote an issue on the Excalidraw GitHub repo. Here it describes the problem. It points to the JSON Canvas spec and it says, good luck. And then, PR's welcome. And kind of bounds it, like Lou said, appropriately. This is for learning. It may not be a particularly useful feature to have yet, but it will help us develop the interop it's a step towards the interop that we're hoping to have. I guess thumbs up from other projects, or feel free to unmute if you want to add additional context around that, because that feels like a really obvious first project that will help us build towards the right spec. I saw a thumbs up from Chris from Excalidraw.
Yeah, one question I had is that, so you talked about optional field, but is there a way to dump data into the other field, or create a field where we can store our app specific data for now, or something like that? Or
yeah, so I would be interested in both, honestly. That's why I was saying kind of like JSON Canvas 1.0, or you could just say like, there's no point at all in doing my tool without these changes to the spec. And so I'm going to imagine a fictional JSON Canvas 2.0 that has some changes, and I'm just going to write an export to this JSON Canvas. It's loosely based on JSON Canvas, but maybe it adds this properties bag like we were talking about. But I think the most interesting thing that would come out of that would be you describing why you chose those specific changes. Like, I moved width and height into the property bag because fill in rationalization. I added these additional properties into the properties bags for these specific purposes. I think this will help us like get a layer deeper. Because honestly, I was surprised at Lou's response that she was thinking this would be hard for TL Draw. I assumed, because Orion seemed to like magically produce it in several hours from the point that we started talking, that it would be an easier thing. But I think the why is it hard would be the thing that we need to know that we don't yet know.
Yeah, I mean, is it me? Yeah.
Yeah, please go. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Just very quickly, yeah, I think part of the reason I think it's hard is because there's a lot of decisions involved around like there are concepts which are incompatible mostly with TL Draw in various ways, like width and height being required, and edges needing a position on their attachment, I believe. I might be wrong. And I think the difficulty will come from how are you going to deal with that? And yeah, maybe it's just ignore it all at this point. That's why I think it's hard.
I think the file express relationship from the nodes, and it doesn't tell you how to draw them. I think that's probably it's still up to the app to decide how to draw those links, because I could see the arrows in TL Draw are probably very different from how it's specified, but that the link exists between those two nodes. So then, you have to interpret a little bit, I guess.
I feel like the elephant in the room is what is the value of the interchange and what are the products here incentivized to produce? If you're looking at it and saying, oh, it's really difficult, is that a function of trying to maintain the same level of visual fidelity so that someone gets exactly the same outcome in another product? And is that a long-term value that's going to be likely to be possible to maintain? So what are we trying to capture and transport between these different tools? And what things are going to, just by the nature of these evolving tools, always be something that the spec would be chasing if we were going to try to encode that? So I'm curious, is there information we want to share across these tools? And I think that got to that earlier conversation about, like, are we trying to maintain the visual fidelity, or are we trying to maintain some sort of information that could be presented in new and novel and useful ways by myriad tools?
Let me call on a couple people. Dragon had his hand up, and then Chris from Escaladraw mentioned something, and then I'll get to Orion. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. So I wanted to step back and see how we approach like the general decision making and prioritization of different works. And it seems there is a lot of ideas, and we can't say necessarily that one idea is kind of more important at the current time than any other. And I was wondering if we should come up with some sort of document where we can maintain different ideas that we have, and then have other people be able to express their desire, which exact project they want to join, and then just have people kind of naturally match and go from there. And then take some time to kind of see where all the different projects end up, and then come up with something more concrete. Because it seems to me that trying to figure out the one thing that we should all be focusing now might be like not so productive.
Good point, Dragon. Yeah, I apologize if that's what it sounded like that. What I was trying to communicate. What I'm thinking for the projects is, and then I'll respond to Dragon, and then Orion, I'll call on you as well. Is this should be something that you opt in for, not something that you get signed up for, that kind of stuff. It's totally fine for us to say, and I do think it'd be helpful to have like a list of things ways that you can contribute, that we can keep in a list. And I think that's something Orion and I can add to the existing GitHub repository, the GitHub organization. We can add a list of like ways you can contribute that has a similar effect to what you were saying, Dragon, of like, here's some projects that people can pick up if they want to help out. And that way we don't have to decide what the one thing is that we're doing. But what I'm most interested in for this first call is people saying, here's the thing that I'm going to do between now and next, 2-3 weeks from now. Like, here's the next step that I'm going to work on right now. And that's the way that I was positioning projects, as not something we're signing everyone up for, but individuals might say, I will do this, and report back, basically. So, but yes to both of your things. Like we'll make a list, and also for the purposes of this call, what would you like to contribute and do? Orion, you're up, buddy.
Yeah. So quickly on that last point, I want to mention that we're planning on having most discussion over on GitHub discussions, so that they are out in public and so that they work for people doing async work. And so we absolutely intend to kind of organize a lot of like the mess that will inevitably come out of these calls into like well-structured discussions over there. And that will also be a place to organize around specific initiatives and so on. The other thing I wanted to mention is, just as a kind of point of comparison, looking at like other specs and protocols, when we look at something like email, part of what allowed it to evolve was the way that it was constructed to basically have this very, very tiny set of required information that made the spec, that made the protocol actually work. But email does actually allow for arbitrary other fields to be added, and a bunch of the features that we now take for granted came out of this kind of more ad hoc coordination on top of this very minimal underlying protocol. That's like how we got things like, like rich hypertext and so on. Then the other one is something like XML, which has support for explicit schemas and also ways to compose them together. So we could imagine, for example, a future spec for Canvas tools having some base versioned spec that has a very minimal set of absolutely mandatory stuff. But then on top of that, you can have more kind of opt-in specs for example, if there is some subset of tools that share a kind of a typed input-output system. I'm thinking specifically of things like React Flow and Staley and so on, and these tools that can be used to author like executable node and wire diagrams and that kind of stuff. Maybe there is a schema for those kinds of nodes that allows more kind of localized coordination, and still gives you that interop where it applies without bringing all of that into the, to not end up with a kind of a spec that just tries to do everything, but to still have coordination around interop for these more niche specific things. I see there's a lot of stuff in the chat here.
You're muted, Jess.
Sorry, muted. Yeah, so I was saying that yes, there's things in the chat. Chris mentions that he would be interested in, or that he'll do the work for mapping between Excalidraw and JSON Canvas 1.0. What is the equivalent of the JSON Canvas spec based on the Excalidraw sort of data model? You want to speak to that, Chris?
Oh yeah, I'm not planning to do a mapping. So what I'm planning to do is take the Excalidraw like file format and write something like the JSON Canvas text, Canvas spec that use the Excalidraw one, and then for each field, then explain like what was the rationale that was in Excalidraw and see if it can be generalized or changed or those kind of things, and then we can see if it's going to apply to like other like projects and everything. So I have like strong feeling that like the current spec right now is like way specific in some places and like way too loose in some. So I don't actually like, I'm not a big fan of like the current spec as is. And so I like to like, I know you wanted to like figure out if we can interrupt with this one, but I don't think it's going to be a good base for like this group of people. And I think it would be better for like actually coming up with like together, like, hey, what would the spec be? And then use this as more like a guidance or so. This is my personal point of view. I don't know if other people agree.
No, I think that's great, and I think you should absolutely take that on. Be very curious to look at that, and then I think the next step from there, once you have that, is also, like I mentioned, looking at other canvases that have very similar feature sets to Excalidraw. So TLDraw, I'm sure that there's a couple of others as we go through the comparison table that Orion put together, that it would be very natural to say, okay, well, how would this spec work for that particular canvas that's not Excalidraw? So love it. I think the reality is we're headed towards some new spec, which will either be JSON Canvas 2.0 or it will be a different thing. And that really, more of that probably depends on Obsidian's perspective on how to evolve the spec, and how much change they want to make. And so we'll see. But I think we're all kind of in agreement that some pretty major structural things need to happen to change. Lou mentions agreement on that one as well. Yeah, John, you spoke and no one responded to what you said. So I apologize for that. I was managing the queue of people with hands up, and I was
out of turn, so I'm sorry. Yeah, I didn't
it's
even see that
totally
mechanism in there.
fine. I think what we're trying to figure out an answer to your question, and I kind of posed it at the beginning of like, what is the valuable thing that we're going to exchange between canvases? Is it something closer to visual fidelity, or is it something closer to the information about the relationship between the objects in the canvas? And it may end up that this sort of bifurcates into two different specs that are more about the relationship between objects, and specs that are more about canvases that are more about visual fidelity. That's part of the work that we're doing in trying to actually attempting interopt in some minimal way across these tools, because I think we'll find the big gaps, and we'll find the places where there's a lot of value there. So
yeah, there's probably great value in how those two could project between each other even.
yeah, this is, and I'll get to you in a sec, Max. Like, one of my visions for this is thinking of the visual fidelity tools as almost like a layer on top of a tool that's more about auto layout. So yeah, I was thinking about, like, there are tools that support freehand drawing. In fact, like, there's the best freehand tool in, TL Draw or whatever. I think the library is called like freehand or something like that. But you might want that on top of another canvas that doesn't have either any freehand support or has less robust freehand support. So thinking about a TL Draw canvas layered on top of another canvas is a really like annotation layers is the way that I'm thinking about this. The same way you can add comments to a text file. And so that would be that's sort of a dream of mine of the way that these things might interop, is that you're not actually interacting with the same object. You're interacting with a layer on top of, and each of these canvases, but they're mapping. Anyway, we'll see. Max, I'll let you speak.
Okay, nice. So for example, what you just propose is exactly what's happening in the graph exchange world. So there's the quite popular tool called YAD from YWorks, which is an auto layout editor. And it actually stores all the stuff in GraphML, a very old, convoluted, XML-based, can do everything exchange format. And then it does some proprietary data extensions to stuff their specific styling and coloring, and even SVG shapes all into that XML. So you can drive it really far in that direction. And I would say about the goals for the interchange format, if we just can exchange, let's say, text and the structure between, we achieved already a lot. So you can already hard migrate from one tool to another one and lose not everything, or send some structured stuff to a colleague and re-import it and reuse it. That's a big thing. And taken to the total extreme, you would have a migration format where you can completely change tools. And I think to create a migration format should not be the first goal, because that's just too much. But just being able to export structure and then more and more visual fidelity on top of it is more achievable. Yeah.
That seems
So
one point on that is going back to the email protocol example, is that part of what made that work is that if someone introduces some new field and you send someone an email with a client that doesn't support it, and then they forward it on to someone else, the explicit design there is to not touch the stuff that you don't know anything about. And I think we could actually get a lot out of just kind of having that principle of, if there is a property on some object that you don't know anything about, by default, don't affect it at all. And that gives you a lot of that kind of ability to bounce stuff around without worrying about your data being butchered. There's another point here that I want to make. I really loved Chris's suggestion of kind of writing down something resembling a spec for your own project, like as if you were basically doing what Obsidian did. I think those would be really valuable artifacts to coordinate around, and we can see where we overlap. I tried to do some of that with this this table that's up on screen, but it's not really the right way to do that, right? Because I was really looking at the specific data model, which is not exactly the same thing. But what I'm wondering is really two things as kind of potential, well, really one thing as a potential near-term question, which is, are there changes that we can make to JSON Canvas right now that don't just help us migrate into some backwards compatible spec in the future, but help people building Canvas systems? Specifically, I'm thinking about people that are not in this group, right? That are not up to date in any of these discussions. can we make some future where there is a non-backwards compatible breaking future spec? Can we make that future easier to handle with actions that we can take kind of in the very near future around JSON Canvas? That's my kind of near-term question. The last thing I'll say is I'm wondering if there would be value, and maybe this happens after we have a kind of speculative spec design around some of these tools for the ones that want to engage with that, where we could kind of very informally speculate around a future spec and actually build interop and build things around that, some imagined JSON Canvas 2.0, but we don't treat it as something that we're really trying to specify, but more as let's imagine what if the spec worked this way, which would be a bunch of breaking changes. It would not be useful for actual users. Yeah, that's all I got.
Awesome. Thanks, Orion. I'm just noticing that we have about 1 minute left. I want to respect people's time for showing up today. So I heard a couple of things. We'll go and transcribe this and talk about it in next steps. It sounds like there's some work that Chris is going to do for the Excalidraw sort of theoretical spec. I'm going to be doing some, I think there's looking into how TLDraw might export to JSON Canvas. There's probably also that same work of like, what would be the theoretical spec for TLDraw. But we'll look at that. That might be something Orion and I work on. Something that I'm already working on is the spreadsheet that's on the screen right now. If any of you do what Chris is doing for your tool, write a theoretical like JSON Canvas open spec, Orion and I will commit to doing the work of like taking those specs and trying to jam them together, like putting them into a shared artifact that we can look at together and have a start a discussion around. So that's kind of a couple of next steps in projects. If you have other stuff you want to volunteer, given that we're like running over a few minutes on time, if people need to head out, thank you for coming. We appreciate you. Feel free to, if you would like to use the Discord as a way of chatting with people who are working on projects, feel free to, but we're going to try to keep everything, we'll try to put things into GitHub discussions and keep some of this stuff async where people can have more of a threaded public discussion and not have to hang out and chat all the time. So thank you all for being here. We'll be in touch about the next time we get together.
Thanks very
Worth
much.
mentioning that we do have that mailing list as well, and things like this recording, any transcripts, associated discussion, a copy of the chat. We'll bundle all of that together and put it there, and I'm sure we'll put a link on the website to that information as well.
Yep, you'll get an email. All right, thanks y'all.
Bye.
Thanks.
Yep.